All right, welcome back to Wrestling Retold and Relived with Richie Mars. I, of course, am your humble and gracious host, Richie Mars. Thank you for joining me this week. Again, you could always follow me on the TikTok, on the Instagram, and the Twitter at Retold Richie Mars. That's for all three of them. Took a little bit of a baby break, but we are back and we are in full force, and we are talking about something that isn't really as talked about as it should be, in my opinion, at least when it concerns modern day wrestling lingo. I am talking about the return of the bro. And I'm not talking about Matt Riddle, I am talking about Vince Russo. For those of you who don't know, Vince Russo is credited as WWE's first ever writer that they've had on their television show. Beforehand, it was just a small booking committee with Vince McMahon and his affiliates. But Vince Russo, who worked as a writer for the WWE, then WWF magazine at the time, would write his thoughts on the wrestling business then. And at that period of time, WWE was in a creative slump creatively. They were also not doing well against their main competitor, World Championship Wrestling, WCW, and hiring Vince Russo, since he wrote all these creative storylines, and he actually confronted Vince McMahon on, I believe it was called Livewire at the time, which was kind of like a quote-unquote behind-the-scenes show with WWE, that it was so obvious that Bret Hart was going to win that year's Royal Rumble in 97 that WWE then pivoted to Stone Cold Steve Austin winning the Royal Rumble in 97. So he is credited with a lot of things in the WWE, especially with the Attitude Era boom. One of his greatest stories, in my opinion, is the corporate turn The Rock made when The Rock was rising in popularity after his very successful heel turn with the Nation. He turned babyface, and the crowd was just getting latched on to him. They were singing along with The Rock, "Do you smell what The Rock is cooking?" And then at Survivor Series, they did a classic double turn, a double switch, a playoff of the Montreal Screwjob, which turned The Rock into the biggest bad guy in the company. At the time, you never really saw someone who was going to be the next popular star then kind of switch forces and then become just as successful as the antagonist of the show. And a lot of Vince Russo's writing gets a lot of flack after he left WWE in 99. Especially, it's been memed to death. You know, everything was a gimmick match. Everything was about Crash TV at that time. Vince Russo would tell you he would watch Jerry Springer, and that was the inspiration in the transitional period from WWE's new era to the Attitude Era, where Stone Cold was running amok. You had all these weird storylines and a lot of things as successful as the Attitude Era was. And I do feel like a lot of that was viewed through rose-covered glasses. A lot of the Attitude Era stuff was either not mentioned or just extremely odd. Even though everybody up and down the card was in a storyline, there were just things that don't get talked about. Like, I remember viewing back, there was a pregnancy angle with Terry Reynolds, and D'Lo knocked her off the apron, and then she lost the baby, so then D'Lo felt bad, so then he's doing all her dirty work for her, and then it was revealed, oh, she wasn't actually pregnant. Just weird stuff like that. There was also a boyfriend-girlfriend domestic violence angle, which was weird. It was implied that this wrestler, Chaz, I believe his name was, Chaz, he was part of the Hangmakers. I think he was headbanger, I want to say Mosh. I think it was Mosh that was it. And his girlfriend would just show up with black eyes, and then that didn't get anyone interested in wrestling, I could tell you that much. And there would be segments where all the men in the locker room would just beat him up because they thought he was abusing his girlfriend, but it later turned out that she was just putting on makeup and just framing him, which was, again, there was no really, there was a payoff, but I don't think it was like, oh, here's how to get this guy to the next level, or how to portray this girl to get her over as a character. So there was a lot of questionable content that happened in the Attitude Era during that time that was criticized in public. But in 99, Vince Russo left WWF to go to WCW, which was even stranger because on air on WCW, where in wrestling you suspend your disbelief. So everything that happens, yeah, like in a real fight, you're not going to sling someone off of ropes and you're not going to bounce off the ropes. You just stop. But in WCW, they announced that Vince Russo and Ed Ferraro, who was his writing partner for WWE, were coming into the company and they're going to take us to the promised land, which is such a weird thing to announce on your television. Saying, you know those guys from the competition that helped beat us in the ratings? Yeah, we just hired them. And it was just a weird time because a lot of focus were them as the writers. They became off-screen characters called the powers that be, where they would just talk off camera and become stars of the show, when I think most of the time in the entertainment industry, writers are usually meant to be kind of in the background creating. You don't want to see how the sausage is made, just as a hypothetical term. And there were a lot of weird things he did in WCW, and that's putting it mildly. There were a lot of gimmick matches. I think it's been memed to death. The blank on a pole match. There was a pinata on a pole match. There was a mother on a forklift match where you had to control the forklift in order to get the mother off the forklift in order to win the match, I guess. I wasn't watching WCW at that time, and I'm kind of curious. I might do a watch along of all these wacky WCW shows, but that's neither here nor there. But the big thing that I was curious about his run was there was a time where Bill Goldberg was one of the biggest stars in WCW, and obviously now WCW kind of fell off the wagon a bit. And they did a storyline where Goldberg was supposed to get powerbombed by Kevin Nash, and he just left the ring. And you see Vince Russo coming out, and he's yelling at Goldberg, and the storyline on commentary, they were saying, oh, Goldberg's refusing to follow the script. And that is the main criticism I have with Vince Russo, is that he assumed that, oh, it's a show, so we all are in on it. We all know it's fake. We all know it's predetermined. We just, since we know that, we could pull stuff like this. But when you're watching an entertainment thing, not everything has to be a fourth wall break. Not everything has to be a wink and a nod to the audience. You don't want to insult the audience's intelligence. But he saw wrestling as a show, which is fine. A lot of people do. But he was giving it where it's like, oh, the world title is just a prop. It's not something that you attain to be. Even though he himself said that when he wanted to make Booker T the world champion, that meant a lot to Booker. And it was just a weird time of just trying to blur these lines, trying to get the hardcore audience in, but also confusing the mass audience. And that's his biggest criticism of wrestling today, is that wrestling is too wrestling based. It's about what he says is the fake match. But that's wrestling. That's the foundation of wrestling. It's not all about Crash TV. Crash TV worked for the time period in the 90s and early 2000s. But once that wears thin, you get that fatigue in. And that's why wrestling ratings went down. That's why any ratings went down. Look at the superhero fatigue we're going through right now. Right after Avengers Endgame, a lot of the superhero hype and fandom kind of fell off because it just wasn't the same anymore. So you got to go through those slumps in order to go through those rising periods, which brings me to what I'm talking about today, because after Vince Russo left WCW as the writer, and WCW closed down due to Time Warner and AOL's merger, the WWE tried to continue on being the monopoly of the wrestling business. They tried to do the WWE versus the Alliance WCW ECW storyline, and that was a major disappointment because you didn't have all the major stars coming back to contribute to the storyline because they were under AOL Time Warner deals, and in order to bring them into the company, you have to buy out their contracts. And a lot of those contracts were for like 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, just ridiculous amounts of money at the time that WWE didn't want to pay for. But on the up hand, it's kind of like investing in something. If you pay for this investment, then it can work out in the end, which is proof when all the WCW stars that were under those deals or let those contracts lapse through then came to WWE and became bigger stars like Rey Mysterio, like Hulk Hogan, like we're going to talk about a little bit briefly here. So the state of WWE in the year 2002, it was a pretty rough transitional period because you had a lot of changes in regards to the presentation. You had The Rock leaving for Hollywood. You had Stone Cold Steve Austin walking out of WWE. You had Hulk Hogan. He had a nostalgia title run for a bit, and then you had Taker take the title off him. And then you had Triple H come back, but he got injured relatively quickly, though they weren't really referencing it on TV as much, and you didn't really have the next guys ready to be built up for that next level. You had potential stars. You had Edge, you had Rob Van Dam, you had Kurt Angle, who was still fairly new at the time, but never really left the main event scene, but you need some more dance partners to actually have a cohesive narrative to flow through your whole show. Brock Lesnar was on the rise, but he was still a couple months into his company. So once Austin left around that time, Vince made the move to call Vince Russo and see if he would be the head writer again. And he did this without telling the other writers on staff. I think there are even stories being told that he didn't even tell his own daughter, who was the head of creative at that point in time. So he basically made a panic hire, even though I doubt people would admit it, but he made a panic hire because the ratings were slipping down. Vince Russo claims they were as low as 3s and 2s, but I checked the ratings during that time, and they were still producing low 4s to high 3s. So it wasn't anything like, oh, it's a collapse of the company. But again, nothing that is ever going to duplicate that Attitude Era where it's like, oh, bro, you got to call your friends. The Rock and Mankind are doing This Is Your Life on The Rock, and it's absolutely hilarious. Nothing is ever going to be to that peak again, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later why. So Vince Russo claims that Vince just wanted to throw him on the writing team right away and wanted to be the head writer of Raw with everybody working under him. But according to, there's just one problem with Brian Gewirtz, who was the head writer of WWE Raw since Vince Russo left, and he even interviewed for the job with Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara when they were leaving. So he was thrown in the fire right away. So Brian Gewirtz was a head writer on Raw. Paul Heyman was the head writer of SmackDown, and they were told this news that Vince Russo was coming in, and both of them were... They weren't scared for their jobs. They were just concerned because, okay, this is going to put the whole creative in flux for a bit, because it's kind of like adding a new writer to a television show that's been on the air for a couple seasons now. What's the dynamic going to change? Is it going to change between seasons? How are the characters that we developed going to be impacted by this? What are going to be the plans? So you can understand the trepidations some writers might have when a new writer is coming in, but not only that, he already has a rapport with your current boss. So who knows how the priorities might shift during that time? Would the old boss believe his old friend, or would they believe the new crop of guys who are already here? And also the talent backstage, when they found out, they weren't really too keen on it for a couple reasons. One, this guy left during the height of the WWE's popularity to go to the competition to help them out. So it would raise a lot of red flags of this guy coming back, this guy try to put us out of business, and now he just wants to stroll in, come back like nothing's happened, bygones be bygones. So there's a lot of negative things that might occur just talent-wise, just being like, wait, this guy who kind of almost screwed us out of a job is now coming back? That doesn't really sit right with me. So Vince Russo's back. He goes into the meeting. He suggests meeting the guys at the King of the Ring pay-per-view. It was around that time period when this was announced, and it was a meeting before the King of the Ring pay-per-view. And Vince said, whatever you do, listen to his ideas. Do not flat out say, no, they can't work. Try to make them work. That was the task the writing staff had. And that writing staff included Paul Heyman, Brian Gewirtz, Michael P.S. Hayes, I believe one other writer, and 3 writers' assistants. When Vince Russo tells the story, he was like, oh, there were 10 to 15 writers. It was not the same anymore, and it was uncomfortable. But Brian Gewirtz was like, yeah, that's not true. There were only a couple writers and a couple writing assistants, but it wasn't 10 to 15 people. And Vince Russo said they were nameless and faceless, which doesn't really make any sense because as a writer, you're supposed to not be in the forefront of anything. But then again, Vince Russo made himself the WCW champion because, it was a prop. So the main thing that Vince Russo pitched, and this is confirmed on both sides with Brian Gewirtz and Vince Russo, is a feud between Eric Bischoff, who used to run WCW, who's the WCW president, and Shane McMahon. And his reasoning for it was because everyone knows about the heat between the two. Now, as a wrestling historian nerd like myself, I've never heard about the heat between the two, or it being mentioned. It was always about Eric and Vince, never about Shane and Eric. It just wasn't something that was in the news at that time. Like, I'm sure there was tension, but I don't think it was a widely known thing that the quote-unquote internet fans at that time, or the people who are in the know, would be like, oh, they're feuding. I don't think anyone would have really looked twice at that and being like, oh, wow, this a really obscure thing is being referenced. I don't think that would have made a difference in the ratings or anything like that. Apparently, there were plans to bring Eric in around that time, or at least a little bit earlier, but Eric was kind of lowballed, and plus the creative just wasn't there. They just wanted him under contract just to have him under contract. He later came in after Vince Russo left his position, and I'll get to that shortly. So the other main thing that was pitched was Undertaker was the champion at the time. Vince Russo said no one thinks Undertaker's cool anymore. It's all about Rob Van Dam, RVD. He's the cool one. That's all my sons talk about. Because Rob Van Dam was the most unique star that they had at that time. He was this cool, laid-back guy who just said, cool, whatever, would just kick your ass, throw a couple martial arts kicks, do some innovative offensive moves, like he did the rolling leg drop off the apron, he did the rolling thunder senton, he did the 5-star frog splash, he had a couple of array of kicks, he did split-legged moonsault. He just looked different and cool, and he also had those airbrush singlets with the Zen logo, some dragons on it. It was just a really cool vibe that RVD had on. And it was very subtle that he was a pothead. I'm raising my eyebrows right now because it wasn't really that subtle at all. They would try to kind of ram that in every chance you get it, where he was like, oh, cool, or whatever. He was basically a cooler Matt Riddle is what I'm trying to say. So the creative team didn't have a problem with Rob Van Dam becoming the champion. But how do we get there? That was the major question, because it's not about the end game when you're coming up with an idea. It's about the end game, and then you have to work backwards and being like, okay, how do we get there? We got the beginning. and we got the end. How do we make the middle make sense for the story? And this is another thing that I'm critical of Vince Russo's creative, just watching what I see on television. There are a lot of beginnings, and that's it. There's the idea that is presented, but there's no transition to making them work. And this is another clear example. What Vince Russo wanted to do, he wanted to strip The Undertaker of the championship, no reason given, and do a tournament to crown Rob Van Dam as the WWE champion. That's all he had in his head. And the writers were like, okay, let's see where this goes. There was no reason. There was a rumor that Vince Russo tried to fire the old guys like The Undertaker, but Brian Gewirtz says he couldn't recall anybody being mentioned about being let go under Vince Russo. But Vince Russo stripping The Undertaker of the WWE Championship without reason, that was true. So they decided to make tournament brackets to crown the new WWE Champion. And for clarification, that year's WrestleMania main event was Chris Jericho defending the WWE Championship against Triple H. And Vince Russo says in the booking meeting, bro, did you guys do Triple H versus Chris Jericho? And Michael Hayes says, that was literally our year's WrestleMania's main event. So a lot of these writers are going in blind with Vince Russo. Not only that, but this guy didn't even bother to catch himself up with the product at the time. He just wanted to come in blind and take over, which is another thing, because Vince Russo is guilty of saying he doesn't watch professional wrestling if he's not involved with it. He will write it, but if he's not involved with it, he just won't mention, which is why you see a bunch of these reset ideas at that time, which is why in WCW they did like the Great Reset with Vince Russo and Eric Bischoff, where everybody vacated their championships and every story that was before their regime was kind of dropped or not mentioned at all, and they decided to do a new story right then and there, leaving a lot of people confused. And it is confusing when you're watching a show and all of a sudden, okay, we're going to change the cast, we're going to recast everybody, and everything you saw beforehand is not going to matter. So that rose a couple of red flags. Then leads to the next issue with Vince Russo that I have with him creatively. There is a over-reliance on repetitive stories. And what I mean by that is he wanted the writers to hire back China and Road Dogg. Now, I know Vince Russo and China were friends, and I can understand giving your friend an opportunity for a job. He said, and I quote, according to Brian Gewirtz, Road Dogg's out of jail, bring them back, and then we could reform DX, which is D-Generation X, which was a faction headed by Triple H. And the problem with this is the over-reliance on reformations of groups and just nothing new creatively there. You could put a nostalgia act back together, but it has to feel new. It has to feel fresh. And at this time, DX maybe was not together for about 2 years, not even 2 years. And there was just nowhere to go with it. Again, this is during a time where WWE is trying to do their brand split between Raw and SmackDown, so stars would only be on Raw, people would be exclusive to SmackDown, and having DX reunite is going to be more of the same. It's not going to be anything different. It's going to remind people of an Attitude Era-esque time when we're in a completely different time period and we're trying to get away from that image. So these were the ideas that Vince Russo laid out for his creative vision going forward. The writing team then went back to Vince McMahon and presented all those ideas. How Vince Russo tells it was when he laid out his creative vision, every writer's jaw dropped to the ground because they knew if his creative vision went forward, then their jobs would be meaningless because Vince Russo had all the ideas to bring WWE back to ratings prominence. What was actually said by the writers were, this guy didn't do the bare minimum research with the product while he was gone to come back to the job that was pretty much gifted to him on a silver platter, and this guy's going to be in charge of us. So let's lay out his creative vision for Vince. They didn't badmouth it. All they said were, these are the plans that Vince Russo has planned. When they mentioned the Shane McMahon, Eric Bischoff storyline, Vince kind of repulsed. He didn't really like that idea. And then when they mentioned the tournament of The Undertaker being stripped of the WWE Championship, Brian Gewirtz says in his book that it looked like Vince had about a month's worth diet of just Taco Bell with his facial expression. And Vince's words were, according to Brian Gewirtz, were, I should have never let that asshole back in the company. So it just wasn't going to work. And because Vince Russo's ideas didn't really fly with the head of the entire company, his head writer position then became a creative consultant, which was essentially watch the shows, take notes, see what we could do better, and then what have you. I believe they said it was a $3,000 a month gig, which isn't bad, just to watch TV and give your opinion on a show. Like, that'd be a pretty sweet gig. But also, Brian Gewirtz would present the writings to Vince Russo over the phone, where Vince would give his own input and what should happen creative-wise. And Brian Gewirtz said Vince Russo is a really creative guy, and that shouldn't be knocked on because he did that thing. He was in the trenches with the McMahons for a time, writing and creating the shows that we all know and love. But it just kind of goes with time that Vince Russo was kind of a one-track kind of writer, where everything was, it's been memed to death, but everything was a swerve. Everything was about being a wink and a nod to the audience when it doesn't need to be about that. Everything seemed a little bit cheap in that regard. I do agree with Vince Russo, because he had an interview with Chris Van Vliet not too long ago, that wrestling should be about characters. And I do agree with that with a certain extent. The more invested you are in a character, the more you could see of a person's character in the ring, outside the ring, how they carry themselves, the more you will get invested into them, and the more you could get invested into your match. Nowadays, for the people who like the work rate, the people who like the awesome 5-star matches, it's about the match first and how they handle the match, and it's kind of about their personalities second. When character, you don't really need to do that much to get a reaction. Look at Stone Cold, look at The Rock, look at LA Knight nowadays, how he got over with little to nothing given to him storyline-wise. And everything he does gets some of the biggest pops of the night, and he's not busting out massive flips or extreme moves. He's not doing all these crazy somersault planchas. He's just himself on the mic, and some people have that charisma and some people don't have that charisma, and their way of charisma is in the ring storytelling, which is nothing wrong with that, but they worked twice as hard in order to get that reaction. So a week later, when he was demoted from head writer to consultant, Vince Russo went to Stephanie McMahon. He didn't like how Stephanie talked to him because, in his words, here was Stephanie who didn't know anything about writing when he was there, and then when he was back, he's suddenly taking orders from Stephanie. I hate to break it to you, Vince, but when you go to a job, you leave that job and someone else is hired into your place, and you feel like they're talking down to you. That's pretty much how business and other jobs work. Sometimes you leave a place, and somebody that you never necessarily didn't really see in that role has taken that role, and now you have to take orders from them. So I think it was more of an ego thing than anything else. Played a factor with Vince Russo leaving because he wasn't in total control anymore, and then he went to take a writer's position for TNA Impact for a couple of years. And that was the brief history of Vince Russo in WWE in the year 2002. The man only lasted a day in the writer's room. And it just kind of goes to show when you have a very prolific writer or anything that comes into a newly established creative, that you have to learn to be more dynamic in how you present creative. You have to be more prepared when pitching creative. And you just need to learn, the product that you're trying to write. And I think Vince Russo's mind is so stuck back into the glory days. This is what made wrestling great. And a lot of people get like that. It's like, oh, I love this time of wrestling. I love this time in wrestling. But sooner or later, you have to evolve with the times. Nothing is going to work forever. There can be a prolonged period of time when you can say, this period to this period, this worked. And sooner or later, the audience will get tired of it. You can't have the same food every day. Because if you do, it becomes boring. And when it becomes boring, you're not having fun anymore. And when you're doing the same crash course TV, it's not going to retain the audience like it once did. People become desensitized after a while. You can only see Stone Cold blow something up so many times. And I think that was the main problem with Vince Russo. Everything he pitched, everything you could see on WCW or TNA after his prime in WWE, there was always a beginning of something and an end of something, but there was no cohesiveness in the middle. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Please let me know what you think about Vince Russo and his creative. Do you think he was right? Do you think he was wrong? Please let me know at Retold Richie Mars on the Twitter, on the TikTok, and on the Instagram. Of course, I'm Richie Mars, your host. I'll see you all again next time. TTFN. Ta-ta for now.